Now we have Mariana Chilton, who's going to provide some insights about these two presentations.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I wanted to say I'm just so grateful to and honored to be asked to be a discussant for these two fabulous papers and this incredible group of scientists that are really pushing the envelope and helping us to be prepared for what's to come. There's a lot of adversity currently and a lot of adversity ahead, and I'm just really grateful that you all are doing this work, and I'm really honored to be here. So thanks to the organizing committee for asking me to comment on these two papers. So I just want to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about the main points in both papers, and I'll raise some questions that came to me based on my own work and my own reflections in reading the working papers so far. And I'll talk about what links both of them. This set of topics is actually quite interconnected, and what connects them is the right to food and trauma. And I'll tell you how I get there in my reads of the work. And then I'll talk about policies to help heal and repair and help us think about how we do our research and make it policy relevant. And finally, just offer up some questions and some ideas about how we can understand and build resilience. All right, before we get started though, this is just out of my great appreciation for both teams of researchers. This is a cartoon by Kino, who's an Argentinian cartoonist, and I'll lead you through with my cursor. You can see this person is having trouble walking.
We're not seeing your slides.
Oh, you're not?
No.
Thank you
I'm
for
excited
speaking
about
up.
this cartoon, so.
Thank you so much for speaking up. One sec. Let me try again. Are you seeing the cartoon now?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, so you can see this person is having some trouble walking, is doing a little huff and puff, and the hair is going up over his head, and then he sees a fish. And then he says, oh, well, that's no wonder. It was so hard for me to walk. And you can see he finds an adaptation, but then here comes the medical profession thinking, oh, this person is bonkers, and then they fly that person away. So I think that what makes working on structural violence and the climate catastrophe so exciting but exhausting is that what you all are trying to capture is something that we are swimming in, breathing in, flying in, walking in, and it's extremely difficult to find ways to identify it. And all of us have a bunch of different ideas about how to proceed. So this is a little bit of humor for the struggles that we're in and that we all share. Okay, so Dr. Singleton and that team has done an incredible job in starting pulling together a scoping review of structural violence and nutrition equity. They focused primarily on different articles that are working to define structural violence and are recognizing the challenge of doing that because many of us have different ways of understanding it, defining it, seeing it, measuring it. They decided to reduce or limit their search to just quantitative studies and focusing on nutrition outcomes primarily, so food insecurity, food purchasing, dietary intake, and sticking within the peer-reviewed literature. And they focus on the US-based type of work, understanding that our context of racism, discrimination, and structural violence is unique to the US. And it's really phenomenal. I can't wait to see what else comes out. I can't wait to learn how all of our work fits together, if it does at all. And I have a few questions that came to me as I was reading. And one of the struggles that Dr. Singleton and others pointed out is that what variable truly represents structural violence? There's so many different types of variables, so many layers to structural violence and different ways of understanding it. I actually think that food insecurity itself is a measure of structural violence. But this is a really deep question. What truly represents that type of a measure? My question is also, could the aperture, could the focus in on food or nutrition-related outcomes, food insecurity, food security, food access, those kinds of things, are there other outcomes that might be important? One of the things that many of us know in the food insecurity world and focusing on hunger and starvation, that actually a lot of the solutions are not based on food alone, and that we ought to broaden our scope and our understanding to pick up issues of energy security, housing security, mental health, those kinds of things. Another question I want to pose is there something that we can learn beyond the borders of the US? Yes, the US is unique given our history, but I think that there's a lot of really fascinating and wonderful work that's happening around the world, in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And I just have to put in a plug. When I started thinking about trauma and violence and the relationship between violence and food insecurity, I was learning from researchers who were working in Africa who were making a connection between HIV/AIDS and food insecurity as rooted in violence against women. So just a curiosity, is there something that we can learn beyond our own borders in the US? I was so happy to hear Dr. Singleton talk about the qualitative research. My concern is that actually the key to understanding structural racism comes from qualitative research. And I encourage the authors to think about what is the relationship between the quantitative and the qualitative. There are lots of mixed method studies that can be very useful and can really broaden the scope of that scoping review to include qualitative research. So I'm glad that that's not getting lost. And what gets lost if you don't use that qualitative research is understanding of history and the life course perspective, as well as the personal narratives of the people who know hunger and poverty firsthand. Finally, my sort of like a general question that we should keep in the background is, how do we bring in the shadows? And what do I mean by that is, what's going on in the subconscious? What are we missing? We're always focusing on what's in the light, but we need to think about what's in the shadows, and to understand that if there's structural violence, that structural violence actually can manifest at the individual level. So is it appropriate to separate individual experiences with violence and discrimination from structural or institutional violence? Lots of more questions as well. In the second paper on the disaster food security scale, very exciting, deeply important, and highly urgent, focusing in on physical barriers, access to appropriate foods. Happy to see about looking at availability and also utilization, as paying attention to do people have actually the wherewithal and the resources to cook? So that brings in issues of energy and water as well. And I was very glad to see that they're paying attention to issues of uncertainty and fear associated with that. So the questions that arose are, what's the role of energy security and water security? If there's no energy for cooking, that could be deeply concerning. Could that be considered in this disaster food security scale? And what about water? Water is so essential. It's a fundamental human need, and you really need water and food together, because you got to cook, you got to wash your vegetables, you need to wash your hands, etc. So the water security issues are extremely important, considering issues of drought, hurricanes and floods, and the concern over lack of potable water and access to water. Could that be something that could be folded into our concern of food insecurity during catastrophes? What is the relationship between people in the land, the ecosystem that is also under threat or could be overrun, overwhelmed? And what about the food system? I'm really glad that those questions are engaged in are integrated into this work. And I think that there's lots of opportunity for the food systems researchers to connect with the food insecurity researchers to come up with some measures that help to overlap. That brings in issues of food sovereignty and local control. How can communities have greater control over the their food system that affects them, knowing that our food system is global. It's run by really large corporations, and yet there's also an alternative, a solidarity economy. There's different ways of sharing food and getting food at local level. I think that we could really learn a lot about what's going on in the local food systems. Also, finally, I think that there is a really important issue that should be connected with developing a disaster food security scale, and that's understanding social resilience, social connections. When we're in the middle of a catastrophe, we need people around us. We need a strong sense of community, being able to ask neighbors and acquaintances, family and friends for help and support. Could this be something that gets integrated into that work? Okay, there are two nodes that really connected both of these papers that I think are really important. The first one has to do with the right to food, which I didn't hear coming out in those presentations, but it could be something that helps to bring that research to a global level, and also helps to strengthen making sure that policymakers are ensuring that we are respecting, protecting, and fulfilling the right to food, not thinking about food as just a basic need, but also as a fundamental human right. And that has to do with availability and utilization. So look at the blue on the screen. The second thing that connects both is this relationship with trauma. So structural violence can have have an impact on individuals and on communities that I see as trauma is underneath that violence, or violence causes the trauma, trauma regenerates violence. And in a climate catastrophe type of a situation, there's lots of uncertainty, lots of fear, and lots of potential for experiencing collective trauma and individual trauma. There were a number of questions that I think are really useful to both, and I'm not answering them today. I just want to get it into people's minds to think about. These are really big questions. Not sure if they're that relevant to measurement, but I do think it's important to remember that we are so dependent on land and on the planet, on soil. What is the relationship? What is our relationship with the land around us? What does it mean? How is the food system affecting food insecurity? And what about food sovereignty? What are food sharing practices? And what is the policy context? To think about the disaster of COVID-19, we think about how different countries responded to the shelter-in-place measures. The US was very slow to respond, very ad hoc. But if you think about what happened in Canada, there was universal basic income almost immediately, where families were receiving 2,000 Canadian dollars a month. In the United States, that context, the lack of response and the lack of comprehensive response caused a major uptick in food insecurity. Yes, there was some pandemic EBT, and there were other different things that were coming together, but it was very patchwork. So what is the policy context in which we're doing that research, in which we're measuring? And what are some opportunities for those who are experiencing the disasters or the structural violence to be able to take leadership in policy change? And how can we understand this through the lens of resilience and repair? So just to give a little bit of education on trauma and why this is important to both of these papers, is trauma is an emotional, cognitive, physical, spiritual, and relational response to a terrible event or to events such as an accident, a rape, or a natural disaster. So we should also understand that the history of enslavement and colonization create traumatic conditions, which affects physical, mental, and spiritual health. So there's individual trauma that many of us have learned about and understand: rape, intimate partner violence, complex trauma, sex trafficking, etc., unaddressed grief. And then there's also historical and intergenerational trauma. So historical trauma, for instance, among American Indians or Native folks, Native nations, that's a cumulative psychological and emotional wounding that happens across the generations that entire communities, entire nations in the US are experiencing. It has a lot to do with unresolved grief. Then there's intergenerational trauma that can happen in the family. If someone experienced trauma, they can actually pass it on through their own individual family. And then, of course, collective trauma, cataclysmic event, something that shatters the fabric of society. etc. Loss of life and a crisis of meaning. So we have to understand that trauma is extremely severe. So when we're paying attention to issues of fear and worry during a climate crisis, or we're paying attention to structural violence, these are severe experiences that affect the body, the brain, all of the organs, etc. So I wanted people to remember that individual trauma and collective trauma are often very much related. And I want to introduce you all to the work of Wendy Ellis and William Dietz, who talk about the pair of ACEs. So there's adverse community experiences and adverse community environments, and they are fractals of each other. So you have food insecurity, which is an adverse community experience, or it could be a adverse household experience, but it's rooted in adverse community environments or potentially structural violence, so poor housing quality and affordability, community disruption, discrimination, those kinds of things. So we have to be careful when we're talking about structural violence to think somehow that it's different than someone experiencing racism and discrimination from the police. Or for instance, an adverse childhood experience is having a parent who was in jail and in prison, and that has to do with mass incarceration. And that is a structural violence issue that's manifesting in a family, manifesting in the individual body. So back to the shadow issue, to have to think about paying attention to the shadows, understanding that when we're experiencing violence and fear, that there's often multiple fractals. So we have to really pay attention to what's going on individually in a person's body or in their own household as a potential reflection of what's going on in the broader community. I just want to make sure I'm good on time. Yeah, so, oops. There are many ways of thinking about solutions to trauma and violence prevention, two-generation approaches. I just want to alert you to two. There's trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed policymaking. Trauma-informed practice realizes the widespread impact of trauma. It creates paths to recovery. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma. It responds to trauma, fully integrates knowledge of trauma and the importance of healing into policies, procedures, and practices. And organizations can actively resist re-traumatization. And I started to use trauma-informed research practices, and I encourage everyone who is working on food insecurity to become more trauma-informed, more trauma-aware. And also, there is trauma-informed policy. So Dr. Bowen and Murshid talk about the principles and values of trauma-informed social policy, which has to do with establishing safety and collaboration, and focusing in on empowerment, choice, and intersectionality. And also Hecht and Ronnie Neff and others have talked about using a trauma-informed policy approach to create a resilient urban food system. So again, this trauma is something that connects both of these types of work that folks have been working on and that I'm commenting on. You have to remember that if there's a climate catastrophe problem, that's a traumatic type of event. It's a collective trauma that gets exacerbated by adverse childhood experiences, homelessness and poverty, and they're feeding off of each other. And so there's a lot of people outside of the food insecurity world who are thinking about transformational resilience. So thinking about how do you have trauma-informed and resilience-skilled residents in a community? How do you create an enabling culture, a culture where there's lots of help all around us and people are prepared for disaster, and a healthy social environment. So lastly, there's a strong relationship between human rights and the rights of nature that can help people to think about resilience. And I have an article with Dr. Olaimo and Sonia Jones in the Present Knowledge and Nutrition, and we talk about the intersection between human rights and the rights of nature. One of the ways to get at that is to think about food sovereignty and indigenous sovereignty. And is there a way that we can incorporate an understanding that food is a fundamental human right? Can we think about the rights of the people who are involved in the food system? So that's providers, growers, fisher people, farmers, indigenous folks, migrant workers, those kinds of things. Thinking about a localized food system, is there a way that we can think about measuring those? And how can we start to work more with nature and think about sustainability for the long term, 7 generations in the future? Knowing that I am running low on time, I will skip this little segment. The 2 other concepts I just want to have in the background of people's minds. If you're thinking about structural violence, then it's time to think about reparations. And reparations is actually a very robust way of thinking about healing and creating policies for a healing environment where we don't have to see food insecurity. And that's compensation for the physical and mental harm of enslavement, rehabilitation, access to medical and psychological care, as well as legal and social services, ensuring that there are public apologies for the genocide and enslavement on US soil, and also a guarantee of non-repeat. And finally, thinking about the rights of nature and the relationship of people and their food, I think about the Ojibwe folks who have been working so hard to protect their land and their water and their right to food, have had to resort to using the rights of nature to protect their monomen, that's their wild rice, as actually a person to protect their rights. And so I think that we can think a lot more about how we're relating to our own food, to the food systems, and to each other. And so we need to bring in more healing, resilience, connection, joy, and justice into our work so that we can inform more healing and reparative policies. Thank you so much for the opportunity to comment on these papers.
Thank you very much, Mariana, for that, those thoughtful comments. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to pose a couple of questions to Chelsea and Lauren and Nadia. And then after that, I'm going to give them the opportunity to answer to some of the questions that Mariana have posed. So let me get first to the question from the audience, just to be sure that we address them. So one of the questions, I will start with Chelsea. So did you consider also expanding the years of your search prior to the year 2000?
Yes, we did think about that. We were trying to think of like what would be a good cutoff point. We really wanted to focus on, you know, like try to think about it as current, as most recent as possible. Just understanding, you know, that, you know, with time and history, things shift and change. So we focused on 2000. However, you know, at this point, you know, since this is a working project, we could expand it. So I think that, you know, we want to make sure we capture everything. We haven't done hand searching yet. So we are going to do some hand searching. We'll probably do forward and backward selection of the papers that end up in our study to see if we're missing anything. So, and that's for the quantitative papers. We have at this point made the decision that we are going to examine the qualitative studies as well. So yeah, so I think that it probably would be good to go and take a look at if there's anything, you know, what's the body of literature looking at prior to 2000? So that's a good question.
Okay, thank you. A second question is, are any groups excluded in the research you review?
Yes, I saw this question in the chat, in the Q&A chat. It's a great question about visibility, since that was something that we talked about in the first session. And I think it ties well, since the prior sessions topics focused on understanding food insecurity and our ability to measure in Latinx populations as well as in Native American populations. And I will say, based off the papers that we do have, there are very few that focus on these populations. Most of the studies that are looking at you know, discrimination that fall into that domain of race that we've put them in are really looking at mostly African-American populations, Black identifying populations, and they're looking at Black-white differences. So I do think that there's definitely a need there. We do have, I think that I can recall off the top of my head one study that focuses on like a Native American population. And I think that the way that they conceptualize or discuss structural violence, they called it historical loss. So they had like definitions of historical loss and how they measured that quantitatively in their study. But yes, that's a great question. And there's very little representation. And even among Asian populations as well. I think that I think I can recall 2 or 3 papers in our stack. I know a couple of the intersectional studies are looking at the intersection of being identifying as a woman and also identifying as Asian. So like the gender-based racism. So yes, that's a great question about visibility. And I think that opens up the opportunity for research, more research.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to ask a couple of questions to Lauren. So one of the questions from from the audience is from Hannah Thornton. She's asking about an aspect of social inaccessibility, which is connection to community or lack of connection to community. And she was wondering, what are your thoughts about that as a component of social inaccessibility?
Yeah, thanks so much, Hannah. And I think Mariana brought some great points about this up as well. So I do think that social resilience or social connection is a really important piece of this. So today we presented on sort of the disaster food security scale that would be administered to households. But I have a whole sort of agenda around this area that looks at community social institutions, and it looks across the food system. So I've interviewed farmers and organizations working in food response and trying to understand capital, so human capital and social capital at the individual level as well as at the community level. Pulling that apart and measuring it is something that is difficult, but connecting that with the food environment work is part of my agenda for the next 5 years. And I actually have some funding specifically to look at the social and built environment and how disasters disrupt the food security broadly when the social and built environment is disrupted. So that is going to grow. So reach out if you want to connect and talk more about that. I would love to.
Thank you, Lauren. I think that I'm going to bring up also a question that was brought up by one of the panelists in case the audience are interested in that. Dr. River actually asked about how what might be some of the practical concerns about gathering self-reported outcomes during a disaster situation.
Yeah, so this is a major concern. So part of our disaster food security scale development is to say sort of what does a full module look like? And then we are very much going to try to see if we can come up with a short form that could be something that is reasonable to try to administer with a disaster affected community members. But sort of having a household measure is just one piece of what we need to be doing to understand food system disruption and food insecurity after disasters. I have a paper out with a collaborator, Urio and Colon Ramos, who's done a lot of work with food security and food access after Hurricane Maria. And so we've actually taken the FEMA National Disaster Recovery Framework, which shows sort of the preparedness, the initial response, short-term and long-term recovery. And we've aligned what we think are the important priorities for monitoring, surveillance, and how to collect that data and what are the important questions the public health community should be asking. And so that publication is out. For the panelists, it's in the chat box. I don't know how to share with the larger group, but I can tell you the name of it. Will that help? You can search it. It is called Capturing Disruptions to Food Availability After Disasters. And it is in disaster medicine and public health preparedness. So you can take a look at the other ways that we need to be doing sort of food environment audits to understand food availability. We need to have lots of measures.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Lauren. Something else that I was thinking about was that when you were talking about the disaster measure and you talk about the different domains that it might actually entail, I was thinking about the current food security measure that we have, and adding all of those domains that you were talking about actually will imply to have a food security model that it seems to be very long. So what are your thoughts about that? Between thinking about a measure that really captures food security in a situation of disasters versus having a measure that is not too long, that it will cause a burden on people.
Yeah, so if I'm getting to give sort of my wish list, I recognize that we are talking about a lot of dimensions, and I think it's really important for a lot of reasons, even at the federal level, to do that type of surveillance and monitoring, but maybe at a different frequency that is used right now for monitoring food insecurity in the U.S. and at the state level. So, I don't know how often, I don't know the specific methodology offhand, but, if every 2 years we were doing an assessment of disaster specific, then we would have some early markers like, hey, things are starting to change, and we could be slightly more proactive than waiting until it's a crisis situation. Looking at you, COVID-19. So I think I think that's one option. I think also, just like we have an 18 item and a 10 item and a 6 item and a 2 item screener, that if we can have a modular approach to say, hey, these are the types of disruptions in this hazard. Let's mobilize these 3 questions. There are great methodologies out there. The Casper is one of them, which is collecting rapid, post disaster data. So if we could add a couple of the most relevant questions to that type of data collection to monitor and be able to drive, meaningful interventions for folks trying to navigate the food landscape, I think that would be really fantastic. And then certainly I would love to identify, we've got 4 areas that we think are just not quite captured and are really important. So if we could get that down to 4, at least sort of bellwether questions that could be included, 18, 22, I mean, what's the difference? That would be wonderful for my purposes, but I'm very realistic about it, but we have to start somewhere. So we're starting with what's important to be measuring.
Okay, thank you very much, Lauren. So I was wondering if both of you would like to respond to any of the questions that Mariana actually posed. We can start with Chelsea.
Yeah, I think I'm happy that this was something that Mariana brought up in her presentation, and it kind of it was something that was brought up in our very last meeting ahead of this conference, was what was looking at these qualitative and mixed method studies. I honestly think that just based off the ones that we have identified, like they do provide a much like I said, a richer understanding of structural violence, and they really have done a lot of work to really understand the constructs and the different ways that that structural violence has historically presented itself. So I know that there's some great studies looking at low-income families who've experienced homelessness, and then one of the forms of structural violence that they have shown is like, not having access to these hunger safety net sort of resources. So not having, food pantries nearby or emergency food supply nearby. That's a form of structural violence. And that's something that's not quantitatively captured in the studies, the quantitative studies that exist. So I think the quantitative studies are telling a story. I think one of the stories is that we need more quantitative research. But I think that we need to better understand the way structural violence can present itself to impact food insecurity, and so we can develop proper measures. And I think looking at the qualitative studies is important. And then also trying to understand what actually represents structural violence, because not having access to a supermarket to me is a form of structural violence. But then also you can look at other structural violence related measures and seeing how that's associated with food access. So looking at it as a dependent variable and as an independent variable as a representation of structural violence. I think that this is very complicated work. I'm happy to be in this space. And I'm happy to at least, with this work, we're laying down some foundation, and hopefully we'll see advances in research, and hopefully we'll see advances in measurement efforts on the structural violence side, as well as the food security side. So
thank you very much. Lauren, if you want to pick one of the questions from Mariana that you would like to answer, please do so.
Yeah, thanks for that opportunity. So one of the things that was sort of put up there was this idea of local and global systems. And I get this question a lot when talking with folks in the out of the public health nutrition sort of space about, well, would it be better if we had sort of more local, micro, all of the terminology, right? And while I think that's certainly great, I think we need that and we need to look at the larger system. So what happens in a disaster is that, so take Hurricane Florence, for example, a lot of farmland was damaged. A lot of, places where livestock were being raised were in uninhabitable. And so, the local farmers market certainly was affected. I talked with a lot of farmers in North Carolina, and after Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricane Florence in 2018, they're very much saying, I don't think I can go on. So I'm 100% in favor of investing in more local, but we also need to be thinking about how the local fits within the state, fits within the national, and fits within the global system, because as I said at the beginning of my talk, disasters by definition overwhelm the local ability to respond. Your systems at the local level will break down. You won't be able to meet those needs. So I think we need a systems approach that takes sort of that, this morning, Hillary Seligman talked about the socio-ecological approach. That is the approach I use in all my work. Because we can't look at the community without looking where it's nested and how that's gonna work out so that the people are okay in the next event.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to our discussant today. And I know that this has been, we have had great conversation, and we're going to continue in a little bit.